Okay, what I'm going to be demonstrating today is this nice little closed edge picot cast on, and I've added a couple of rows of eyelets after the little picot cast on, and you can do anything you want to after that. You could do ribbing, you can eliminate the eyelets, whatever you want to do after the cast on. I've used it on this little Christmas ornament to make it look like crochet across the top, and I just gathered it up. So that's really cute using it like that. So I've got waste yarn threaded in my tension mast. I'm using a knitting machine tension mast here to control my tension and to control the yarn. So that's why you'll see that I'm not holding on to the yarn at all. And my tension mast here has a little knob at the top where I can make it tighter. So I control my tension from the mast and not from the cam here. So you need to knit a couple of notches looser than you normally do, because it's going to make transferring these stitches a whole lot easier. So I've threaded my main yarn in at the same time as my waste yarn, and I want to overlap a little bit. So I'm going to put my main yarn before needle number 1. I have needle number 1 marked. You always have to have a needle number 1, and I like mine to be where I start my heels and toes. So that's just the way I do it. But you have to know where your needle number 1 is. So I'm going to push that down a little bit if I can. Make sure that yarn stays in the latch or above the latch of that needle. So needle number 1 is going down. It's grabbing both the main yarn and the waste yarn. I don't always overlap like that, but on this project I seem to drop stitches at the beginning if I don't. But usually I like to know where the gap is, and there is so much static in that yarn, it's not even funny. So let me put a little weight on there. And with these circular machines, any of them, this particular machine, the cylinder turns around. On my other machine, the yarn carrier carries the yarn into the needles and goes around. So you have to pay attention where your needle number 1 is and what's fixing to happen with the row. So on any of these circular machines, you can't do like you do on a flatbed knitting machine where you already know, you already set up the row before you ever pass the carriage, so you know what's going to be happening. On these, you always have to know, I'm not going to go too far past this point because my needles are going to get stuck underneath the cams, and then I won't be able to do certain things. So you always need to think ahead a couple of rows to decide what you want to do with the needles. Okay, these needles have already started row 1. So for the design that I'm demonstrating today, I'm going to go ahead and start emptying every other needle on this row instead of waiting another row. You can decide how many rows you want to do this way, but for this sample I am going to do immediately on the first row, and it makes it a little bit more firm on the edge. So again, I can start it on the second row if I want to or not, just experiment. So I'm going to try to do this where it can be seen on the camera, but normally I'm working right here. So I'm going to start with needle number 2, and I'm going to transfer this to the neighbor that's behind it. If it were facing me here, I go to the right to begin with. So right and left can be different on different machines, especially when the yarn carrier is moving around, then you're looking at all angles. So just move it to a neighbor and then do the same thing with the rest of the needles that you transfer. So I'm going to take this next stitch, so this needle is doubled up, and then I'm going to empty the next stitch onto its neighbor. So we'll have an empty needle in between all of these doubled up. So I'm going to bring this around to where I can move a little faster. I'm still on row 1. And always know where your needle number 1 is. Every time I crank forward, I check where number 1 is, and I check what's going to be happening next at the yarn carrier. So needle number 1 is almost finished with its row 1, but the rest of these needles have not finished yet. Don't want to split that. Alright, now needle number 1 has made it back around, so I'm going to count row 1 and I'm going to check my notes to see what needs to be happening with row 2. So the job of row 2 is all of these empty needles are going to start picking up loops just like you do on a cast on row. So you're going to have these upside down V's on every empty needle. And I watch them as they come out this other side to make sure that they actually have picked up a loop. If they didn't, I'll lift that loop over the needle. Because sometimes when they're empty, there's nothing holding them up and they kind of drop down inside of the machine before they get ready to, before they grab a loop. So you have to be watching them as they exit. So I'm going to continue the first job that I started on the rest of these needles all the way to the last needle. Now I'm going to check everything out, crank forward, and see they're grabbing loops like they're supposed to. I have not tried this on the Addy knitting machine. The needles on the Addy knitting machine are a little bit hard to manipulate. Or should I say the stitches on those needles. So if one of these needles had missed picking up loops over here, they would come out of the machine or come out of the yarn carrier looking like that with just some bars across there. So once that needle pokes its head up, I can repair that stitch if it did not pick up like it should have. So let me transfer a few more of these. And then I'll crank forward. And then I'll just lift up the loop because that's what the needle was supposed to have done. Those are really easy to fix. Just keep your eye on it. Because sometimes they're hard to catch when they get over here, because you don't really see them until it's too late. Now if you're using one of the other machines where the carrier carries the yarn around, you'll have to keep an eye on it a different way. But this one's really easy to see what's going on. So there's my needle number 1. I'm checking all these upside down V's. This one I waited a little bit too long. It's already starting to drop down into the machine. This is my last needle for the transfer. So I'm going to stop right here. And again, row number 3 is going to be knitting off these loops. So we have row 1 and then row 2. So I'm just going to crank forward at this point and get my needle number 1 all the way back to the yarn carrier. That's the end of row 2. So the job of row 3 is to knit off these loops, and the job of row 4 is to hang our hem. So I'm going to go ahead and let these get started on row 3. Here's my needle number 1. And sometimes you can't get to that because it's part of the tail, but it looks like I can, but you have to not miss this one. That one belongs to needle number 1. It's a little tiny loop, and that's like hanging the hem on a hung hem technique. So pick up that bottom loop, and when knitting is formed, you'll see you got up knits, down, up, down. So in between all of these columns of knit stitches, you have a little smile at the bottom of a row. And what we're doing is pulling up that loop to lock that row, and that's why it won't run once you remove your waste yarn. So this little tight loop is getting pulled up. I really need to remove my weights. Anytime you're doing a hung hem, you need to remove your weights. So I'm going to knit forward a little bit, and so I can remove my weights at the last minute, but I still want to be able to see without leaning into the camera. So once I remove my weights, I'm going to have to remember to pull down on the knitting every time I crank forward. Sometimes I'll leave a little bit of weight on there, but I'm hanging on to it so I don't lose any stitches, so they don't start jumping off the needles. Okay, so where did I leave it off? This one's doubled up, so hopefully you can see there's a little tiny loop right here. So I've got a little one and a loose one. A small one. And then the one that's on the eyelet is going to be loose. So go all the way around hanging these. Just like you hang a hem, but you don't want to miss any because the row will, some of the stitches will unravel. I have done it with wool yarn before, and I skipped these on purpose, and they really didn't go anywhere. But then other yarn I've used, you could tell that I didn't pick those loops up. Alright, let's stop and think about what is happening. I've got row 1, 2, and 3. I'm on row 4. And by the time you get to row 5, you can start knitting whatever you want to do. So, I'm still pulling down on this so my stitches don't jump off. I could use a ½ pound weight on the bottom, and that would help me out a little bit so I wouldn't have to hang on to this. But it doesn't take too long to hang these. I'm going to loosen up a little bit on my weight that I'm pulling because I can't get to that loop right there. And this is why I like to loosen my tension on this technique, because those little tiny loops, when I've forgotten to loosen my tension, I can hardly get those out of that because they get pulled in with all the rest of the stitching beside them. Sometimes you can borrow from the stitch beside it and kind of pull it out, and it'll grab yarn from both sides of it. Alright, I'm going to have to crank forward now because I'm running out of needles, so I'm pulling down hard and knitting forward. And here's my needle number 1. So I'm loosening up my pressure down below. I'm hoping that my hands are not in the way. Pulling down on the knitting. I'm going to go ahead and get needle number 1 ready for the next row. And I'm going to go ahead and count that row. That's actually row 4. Actually, that was row 3. Because we have 1, 2, 3. And row 4 will knit all of these doubled loops off. So I was getting a little ahead of myself. Okay, I'm pulling down on the knitting, and I'm going to go ahead and start row 4, making sure those doubled stitches are behaving and dropping below the latches like they should, and soon I'll be able to put my weights back on. I think I grabbed too many loops. Okay, pulling down. Now I need to loosen up on the pressure from me pulling down there and open up this stitch. Starting to get a little tight on me. Alright, and there is my last needle, and I was able to take care of needle number 1 at the beginning, so now I can hang my weights. Okay, I've got my weights hung. Row number 4 has already started knitting off those doubled loops. So I'm going to do this one really slowly, paying attention to the double loops as they drop below the latches. Here's my needle number 1. Alright, so I have finished round number 4. So you can decide at this point whether you want these eyelets. So I did alternating. Probably 3 rows would look good, but I'm just going to do 2. So the reason I say that, I'm deciding now because I haven't even started round number 5. But for the sample here, I started the eyelets right away. You can knit 1 plain row after this cast on if you want to, and then start your eyelets or whatever pattern that you want to do. But I liked the crochet look or the lacy look, so I started my eyelets as soon as round number 4 finished. So I'm going to slowly crank forward, and you can tighten up on your tension a little bit, but I'm not going to since I'm still doing a lace procedure. So here's my needle number 1, and to make it easier on me, I'm going to go ahead and almost finish round number 5. And I'm going to start transferring stitches again, every other needle or whatever design you want to its neighbor to the right. And the next row we're going to alternate. We're going to do the 3rd needle. Right now I'm starting with the 2nd needle. And again, we have to make sure these empty needles pick up loops as they are passing through the yarn carrier. So since you've already seen me do this before, I'm going to go on and move up a little farther and then meet you back when I think it's time to show you something different. So my needle number 1 has already passed through the yarn carrier, so that's 5 completed rounds, and it is beginning round number 6. Okay, I'm still finishing up round number 5. My needle number 1 and all of these needles have already started knitting round number 6, and they've picked up all of these loops. That's why I say just keep on watching your needle number 1 so you know where it is all the time. Alright, last needle of that round. So I'm placing that, I'm doubling up on needle number 1. In the first round, or the first lace round, we started with needle number 2 and all the even needles, and even numbered needles, and hung loops on them, or knitted loops on them. But now we're going to do all the odd numbered needles, but I don't want to start with needle number 1 because it's doubled up on there, so I'm going to wait till it comes back around again. So now needle number 1 is fixing to make it back to the yarn carrier, and we're already starting round 6 right here. So I'm going to go to needle number 3 because it's got a knit stitch on it. This is one of those little V loops, little V-shaped loop. I'm going to start with needle number 3 and transfer it to its neighbor. And every odd numbered needle all the way around. And again, we're going to have to watch those loops as they form. And I'm sure you've pretty well got it by now. So I'm going to go forward and meet you back whenever I get closer to the end of this round. So what I'm doing is I'm starting round 6, I'm making sure the empty needles pick up loops just as before, and I'm still finishing the transfers from the previous row. Alright, my needle number 1 is coming around. I'm still doing my transfers for the last eyelet row. This is still my second eyelet row. And there is almost the last odd numbered needle, but remember we skipped needle number 1 at the beginning, so I'm going to go ahead and transfer it over. So I'll have an eyelet there. If you skip needle number 1, you'll have a place there where there's no eyelet. So now I can go ahead and finish that round, still making sure that they're picking up loops. So that's the end of round 6, and after that you can do plain rows, and see what that did was it alternated, it made those eyelets lean. You can do a certain pattern, I don't have a sample here, where they all lean in one direction, and then you can start transferring the needles in a different direction, and then they start leaning the other way. But those are usually more obvious whenever you, here's a sample right here. I was picking up loops and transferring the loops and not stitches on this one. That's a pattern that was taken out of one of those antique manuals that you can find online for the old knitting, the old sock machines, like Gearhart and some of those. So to just keep on knitting, I'm going to go ahead and slowly start knitting those loops off, and I'm just going to knit several rounds just like I'm going to just start a project in plain knitting. But I do want to go slow until all of these stitches have knit like they're supposed to. So my needle number 1 is back to the beginning. At this point I can set my tension for whatever you want it to be for your project. You can put your tension back to whatever you normally do for your yarn. But I'm going to knit a few rounds of plain knitting and then take this off the machine. Taking my weights off and my buckle. So what I did on my sample that I showed you, I brought this over to the steam iron, or my pressing station, and I laid this out. Actually, I put it on a sleeve board. You know, it's one of those little, it's not a sleeve board, a sleeve roll, and I laid it on, I put it in there to give it some shape, and then I steam this before I ever remove the waist joint, and that really helps those picots to be pronounced. But for now, I'm just going to go ahead and cut the waist joint off of this project. Alright, I just got most of the waist joint off of here. It's really curly right now, but you saw what the steamed sample looks like. And this will not unravel because it is a hung hem. It's a little tiny, short hung hem, but it is a closed edge cast on.